Finally, in a bit of good news, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire. Now, I'll get to the details of that ceasefire in a second. First, I want to show you the ceasefire that didn't happen. So there's this assumption out there that I'm sure many have, based on how mainstream press at large discusses this issue, that, there hasn't been a ceasefire up to this point, mostly because of Hamas, or maybe because of both sides that they can't agree. When the reality is, Hamas has been asking for a ceasefire since last week. In fact, this story in I-24, Netanyahu, Israel rejected Hamas ceasefire offer. Now you may think, but Hamas must have been asking for something, must have been asking for the world. That's why Israel couldn't agree to the ceasefire. No, Hamas only asking for what is in accordance with international law. So one, Israeli forces must stop incursions into the Al-Aqsa compound and respect the site. Two, Israel must stop the forced evacuation of the Palestinian residents in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. This condition is in accordance with international law, not only a condition expected by the Hamas Authority. So this is what Hamas asked for in ceasefire negotiations, and Israel said no. So Israel, again, the Israeli government wanting to continue rejecting international law, wanted to continue violating international law, human rights, with their human rights violations, and instead agreed to a ceasefire with no conditions. So this from the Washington Post. Israel's Security Cabinet voted Thursday night to approve a ceasefire in its 11-day aerial battle with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, according to the office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, first, let me just stop here. In its 11-day aerial battle with Hamas. Now, the typical reader will see this and think, so they were both exchanging airstrikes, right? Hamas with their giant warplanes dropping bombs on Israel, and Israel doing the same to Gaza, when that's not the case. So this is why people have this impression that Hamas has a giant military and all this power, just like Israel, when they don't. But this is how these stories are written. So again, misconstruing the entire narrative to make you think that that this is an even fight here, when the Israeli government is the oppressor. They control Gaza. They control its borders. People in Gaza cannot leave. The Palestinians there cannot leave. 2 million people living there, one of the most densely populated areas on earth. This is not an even fight. The cabinet, made up of top security officials and ministers, voted unanimously to accept the Egyptian initiative for a bilateral ceasefire without any conditions, which will take effect later, according to a statement. So that's going to take effect, I believe, Friday morning. I'll get some more details on that in a second. There's a video coming up from MSNBC. But so finally, despite the fact that the other ceasefire would have been fine, would have made more sense, it's still good that at least the back and forth here will stop for the time being. But understand, this isn't over. This crisis is not over. This continues. The Palestinians keep being oppressed. The Israelis will continue pushing Palestinians off their land, and this crisis is only going to continue. Sure, in the meantime, the bombs are going to stop, but that doesn't mean the crisis in general is over. Now, just to give you an overview here in terms of the death toll from both sides, the Palestinian death toll in Gaza rose to 230, including at least 65 children. Local health officials said Wednesday. In the West Bank, at least 21 Palestinians have been killed since Friday, officials there said. The death toll in Israel stood at 12, including 2 children, after police said 2 tire workers were killed Tuesday by rockets fired from Gaza. So it's pretty clear here. Look, not to excuse any violence, but you can see the difference in power here when you have 230 Palestinians killed, including 65 children, and 12 Israelis killed. Now, again, any death is horrible, but to properly understand the crisis, you have to understand who has power to end this crisis. The Israeli government has the power to free Palestinians. The Palestinians have no power in that regard. So when we're looking at how this crisis can end, it has to be with the Israeli government deciding to free Palestinians. Now, I'm going to show you a clip here. I got this up because it's going to be the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency Director, Matthias Schmale. So this is where he works. They provide help and protection for Palestinians that are in Gaza. So here he is on MSNBC, learning of the news of the ceasefire and discussing what needs to be done from here.
Yeah, and I just want to let our viewers know that while you and I were speaking, NBC News has confirmed, in fact, that the Israeli Security Cabinet has now issued a decision to end hostilities and declare a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We certainly hope that will alleviate some of the suffering you and your organization are going through there. What is it that you need immediately? Because as we now move away from this phase where it was consuming the international diplomatic efforts and attention, the spotlight's going to go away and people may forget what it is that you're doing on the ground. What are you going to need in the weeks, in the months ahead to rebuild what you just lived through?
So I think there are three things I'd like to say. First of all, we have to get our normal services back up and running, and that includes in particular education. You know, children need to get a sense of normality if that is possible so quickly. Secondly, we have to focus on the people who've lost their homes, whose homes were bombed to the ground or which are so badly damaged they can't go back. I'm told there's at least 8,000 who are in that situation. So they will need priority support. And then we have to look into what can we do to help them rebuild houses. And then thirdly, and I really want to emphasize this point, I think the biggest damage is trauma. You know, this is another layer of trauma after the 2 years of great marches of return, the COVID year, and now this, and before that 3 wars. So people are traumatized, and I think the biggest need to rebuild will be in people's lives, giving them a sense of coping and opening up a new horizon. If, as I heard some of your previous speakers talk, we need a serious new beginning. Otherwise, we'll be back in this in a couple of months' time.
So, as he said there's a lot of rebuilding to do. A lot of people lost their homes that now need places to live. But on top of that, he also brings up trauma. And I want to bring up some data related to that. So, this from USA Today. A 2020 study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychiatry found that among Palestinian children and adolescents in the Gaza Strip, nearly 90% had experienced personal trauma, and more than 80% had witnessed trauma to others. In Gaza, it is virtually impossible, experts say, for children to access mental health care. Quote, "It's that utter sense of and inability to do anything about it that makes the impact of it far worse." And more data on this. So another study shows the results shows that 54% of the children suffered from severe in Gaza suffered from severe, 33.5% from moderate, and 11% from mild and doubtful levels of PTSD. So you're looking at numbers here where the majority of children suffer from PTSD. And then the girls were more vulnerable. 58% of them suffered from severe PTSD. Thank God there's a ceasefire and the immediate carnage will stop, but the damage has been done. And this sort of damage will last for decades.